Hi, we are fortunate that Rabbi Amy Bigman from Congregation Shaarey Zedek is joining us today and is going to talk to us about the Hebrew Scriptures and the Jewish Bible and help us get a deeper perspective of how our Jewish neighbors approach these same scriptures that we share. So I'm going to turn it over to Amy.
Well, thanks, Kat. Thanks for inviting me to come back to the church. I'm sorry I can't actually be there in person. Our religious school calendar does not mesh with your sessions time-wise, but I'm really glad that we found this way to do this. So what I thought I would do to start us off is to talk about the Jewish Bible, what we call it, how it's divided up, and then talk a little bit about how we use this in our daily lives, so to speak. So one of the things I want to do for all of you is share with you something that I put together a number of years ago, and that is the components of the Tanakh. So the first thing is that in Hebrew, the Jewish Bible is called the Tanakh, and it's an acronym. And the T sound in Hebrew, the letter Tav, stands for the word Torah, which means teaching. And the N sound is the Hebrew letter Nun, which stands for Niviem the Prophets. And the Ch sound at the end of the word, when it is at the beginning of a word in Hebrew, sounds like a K sound. And it's the Ketuvim, the writings. And so we have this tripartite division. The Torah, the teaching, oftentimes mistranslated as the law, but really the teaching. The Hebrew root for Torah is the same as for Morah, which is a female teacher, or Moreh, which is a male teacher. It's also the same root as the word Horim, which means parents, because our parents are our first and best teachers. And so it really means teaching. It doesn't mean law. But the Torah, as you can see, is mainly a narrative. It tells the history of the Israelites, which is what Jews were called back in biblical times, starting with the creation of the universe, with the two stories of creation at the beginning of Genesis. Talks about the lives of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and their families. That's all in the book of Genesis. We move on to the book of Exodus, where the Israelites are slaves to the Pharaoh in Egypt, eventually are allowed to leave Exodus, to make an Exodus, to leave Egypt. The majority of the rest of the Torah is the story of what happened during these wanderings for 40 years in the desert. And the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai. There's a famous story of Moses going up Mount Sinai, and God dictates all of the words that are in the Tanakh. Now, that's what traditionally is taught in Judaism. I'd say most of us look at these texts today as human documents that were written at various times and by various people. And so sometimes we have things that contradict each other or tell the story a slightly different way. So as I mentioned, there's two stories of creation at the beginning of Genesis. When we get to Noah and the ark, most of us know that story as, two animals of every kind come onto the ark. But woven into that is a second story that talks about a different number and whether the animals were considered to be clean or unclean and so on. And it's all sort of mushed up together, which leads most of us to believe that these were stories written by people, that somehow the stories were put together, they were meshed together. But traditional Judaism would say that all of this was given to Moses on Mount Sinai. On Mount Sinai, Moses wrote down everything that God gave to him. The second part of the Tanakh is the Niviem, the prophets. And this is divided into two parts, sometimes called the major prophets and the minor prophets. But that tends to make people think that the major prophets are better and more important. and the minor less so. And so the preferred terms really former prophets and latter prophets. And this, some of these have narrative, and they continue the story that goes from Genesis through Deuteronomy. So we pick up with the former prophets with the book of Joshua, which is an exact continuation. Moses dies at the end of Deuteronomy, and leadership is turned over to Joshua, and then it goes on. And you'll see that the former prophets are Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings. And you'll see that I have little notes by 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. And then we have the latter prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. They way they speak to the people. They're more what we think of when we think of prophets, that they are people who go and talk to the people about how they're behaving. Basically, for the most part, they're telling the people that you're not doing exactly what God wants you to do, and here's how you can do it better. It's not all negative. There's certainly plenty of positive in there, but they come to, make sure that the people are doing what they're supposed to be doing. And then we have the 12 prophets, Hosea through Malachi. These prophets, their stories tend to be much shorter. Their books are much shorter. Like the book of Obadiah is just 1 chapter. The book of Malachi, I think, is 4 or 5 chapters. So they are listed as the 12 prophets. And let me stop here before I get to the Ketuvim and explain to you why these numbers are the way that they're numbered. If you look at all of the books that are in the Bible, in the Jewish version of the Bible, we would look at it probably and count each of these separately. So each of those 12 prophets would be considered their own book. 1st Samuel is its own, 2nd Samuel is its own, and so on. And you would come up with a number 39. But originally, the number 24 was the number that was given to the number of books in the Tanakh. And so there's a different way of counting. So traditionally, 1st and 2nd Samuel were just the book of Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings was just the book of Kings, and so on. And the reason that they get divided is really a really practical one, actually. You have to remember that in ancient times, all of these books were written not in book form like we have them today, but on scrolls. And in fact, the Torah, Genesis through Deuteronomy, is still written on a scroll. But the other books were also written on scrolls, and the book of Samuel and the book of Kings were just too long the scrolls were getting too heavy in effect. And so they divided those up. The 12 prophets, on the other hand, were so short that they didn't need entire scrolls for them. And so they were written on one scroll, and so were counted as one book. So that's helps us to understand this counting. I would look at these books and say, oh, there's 39 different books, but the ancient traditional counting would include these books put together or these books separated, as you see on the screen. And then we get to the third part of the Tanakh, the Ketuvim, the writings. So these writings are all very different than what comes before. We do have some historical narrative in some of these texts, but also some other things, some wisdom literature, and so on. The Book of Psalms is probably the book that's most well known to Christians. Certainly, when I come to worship with all of you in different settings, it's not unusual for me to go into a church and hear the Psalms read or sung, and used in funeral liturgy and so on, just as we do. And then the books of Song of Songs, Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, and Esther are all in a row because they are all associated with different holidays in the Jewish calendar. So Song of Songs, which many Christians call Song of Solomon. In Hebrew, it's Shir HaShirim, Song of Songs. It is part of the liturgy for the holiday of Passover. And we go through Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, and Esther for a total of 5 holidays, each book related to a given holiday. So they are in a specific order. One of the things that I'm going to send to Kit is a list that I put together comparing the Tanakh with the Catholic Old Testament and with the Protestant Old Testament. And one of the things that's important to know is that the Protestant Old Testament and the Jewish Bible, the Tanakh, have the same exact books. All of these books that are on the screen all appear in the Protestant Old Testament. But the Catholic Old Testament has these books and adds other books to them. What we would call the apocryphal literature, the literature that didn't get into the Tanakh for a variety of reasons. But one of the differences that we see between the Jewish Bible, in addition to whether or not there are additional books in them and in the Old Testament, is that we have a different order. And that's one of the things that you'll see when I send this to Kit, is that the books in the Christian versions of the Old Testament are in chronological order. And this happened because when the Jews of Alexandria translated from Hebrew into their language, they rearranged the order of the books and they put them into this chronological order. And then when Christians translated from the Alexandrian version, from the Greek, they kept that order. So, so most Christian Bibles that I'm aware of translate from the Greek as opposed to translating from the Hebrew. And as I said, they keep that order. And in the Catholic version, they add in different books. Protestant versions will have what's usually called the Apocrypha. Sometimes it's called the pseudepigrapha and other terms, but the word Apocrypha comes from the Greek, and it means that these books were hidden away. And we don't know for sure why these books were hidden away and didn't make it into the, I'm going to stop the share so you aren't distracted. We're not really sure for sure why all of these books didn't make it into the Jewish Bible. Some think that they had, mysterious or esoteric things in them. Some think that some of the books were too profound, that only a select, very highly intelligent person could understand them, and others might be led astray. Some of the books were judged to be heretical or just counterfeit. And so they were not included in the Tanakh. Now, for Jewish kids around the world, I would say Jewish kids are all very excited that Christians kept some of these books, because the books of the Maccabees contain a lot of stuff, including the story of the holiday that we now celebrate as Hanukkah. But it's actually not in our Bible. So, so I want to stop there as far as what's in the Tanakh. And Kit, if there's anything that you want me to share before I tell you a little bit more about how we use the Bible today.
I have a question why they're called the former prophets when they're really kind of historical books and not what we think of as a prophet sent by God to give a message.
I don't have an answer for that. I don't know. It is confusing because those books do continue, as I mentioned, they do continue the story that ends in Deuteronomy, and they just continue it as historical books. And I put historical in quotation marks because while traditional Jews would say, of course, this is the history of our people, I'm not so sure that every single thing that happened that's described actually happened in the world. But that's me coming from a more liberal perspective. I don't know why they didn't make it into 4 parts, perhaps. But there's clearly a hierarchy, if you will. The Torah, the first 5 books, are the most important, and we read those. I'll just sort of answer your question as I go into the other part. We read those on a weekly basis. So there's a portion from Genesis it could be 3, 4, 5 chapters of the book. And then the next portion, the next week continues the next several chapters and so on. So we read from the beginning of Genesis through the end of Deuteronomy in a year's time. And that's different than how most churches do that, right? Your calendar will have different parts of both the Jewish Bible and the New Testament, but not in order, right? So you might be reading from the Gospel of Mark, and 1 week, and then the next week it might be Matthew for 3 weeks, and it might be, Luke for another week or whatever. And we don't do it that way for the Torah. The Torah is straight through. But on each Shabbat, on each Sabbath, there is a section from somewhere else in the Tanakh, most often from the prophets, that is taken and is read along with the weekly portion. And it usually has something to do with something that's happened in that Torah portion. So it may just be, for instance, there's one extra portion, which is called the Haftarah portion, where when we're reading the story of Noah, this comes from another text, and it just mentions Noah in one sentence, and they make that connection. Sometimes if the Torah portion has something to do with a specific holiday, then that text, that accompanying text, would have something to do with that holiday, and so on. And then there's a whole section of the year where those additional readings have nothing to do with the weekly portion, but have everything to do with getting ready for the High Holy Days. So there are 3 sections that we read that talk about the destruction of the temple and other things, and then 10 that we read, and those 10 come from the book of Isaiah, that are that first bemoan the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, and then get more and more positive as we get closer to our new year, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And so, so those, like I said, those come from the book of Isaiah, which is considered, is considered a prophet. I don't really have a good answer to your actual question about why they call the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings prophets. I don't have that. Perhaps at some point in rabbinic school I learned that, but I don't remember it at this.
I don't know, unless Samuel was sent as a prophet, but that doesn't explain about Joshua.
Yeah. And so it is strange, but those former prophets definitely continue that historical narrative in a way that the latter prophets don't. The latter prophets most of the latter prophets are presented as poems, very little just narrative. They're usually in some kind of poetic form. So they do definitely have a difference, which is why they're divided within that second part of the Tanakh. But I don't know why the former are considered the prophets. Yeah. Okay. So, and then we use, as I mentioned before, the Book of Psalms, just as you use in your liturgy the Psalms for various occasions, we do as well. In fact, each day of the week has its own psalm attached to it. And so when Jews who pray traditionally 3 times a day, that psalm would be included in the liturgy at those times. As I mentioned, we use psalms certainly at funerals. Of course, the most common one is the 23rd Psalm. That's the most well-known, but others as well. And Psalms are used in a section of our liturgy, which is, I guess, a section you could say that's a getting ready to pray kind of section. Right before we have our call to worship, we probably have on a given Sabbath 10 to 15 minutes of let's get ready to pray kind of things. And a lot of that, if not all of that, comes from the book of Psalms. So we Psalms are used throughout the liturgy. When we take the Torah scroll out of the ark in preparation to read it on Shabbat, there are songs before that are sung. There are songs later as we're returning the Torah to the Ark, almost all of which comes from various psalms.
Can you talk about that as you're getting into the liturgy question? Because when I've been to worship at your synagogue, the whole liturgical aspect of how the scroll is kept in a
Mhm,
tabernacle sort of behind
mhm.
on the bema, you don't have an altar, you have a table, but the layout is very similar to what we have.
Yeah,
And the liturgical aspect of how you go to the scroll and take it out and handle it and everything is really sacramental when I look at it, that there is something special and holy going on.
sure. I mean, we wouldn't use the word sacramental because that has definitely a Christian
Right.
connotation, but it's what it's supposed to do is it's supposed to, I'm not even sure a lot of Jews know this, it's supposed to reenact the giving of the Torah to Moses on Mount Sinai. So if you think back to that story, that in the book of Exodus, you have Moses up on the mountain, presumably writing all of these things down, and then brings down, it's usually represented by the Ten Commandments, but we understand that the Ten Commandments are there to represent all of the Tanakh. Brings it down the mountain to the people that are waiting at the bottom of the mountain. And then this is shared. And we see in Ezra and Nehemiah, we see more about how the Torah scroll was read. It was read in the public square 3 times a week, Monday mornings and Thursday mornings, because those were market days. So that was when people would be coming. And then they could use that as an opportunity to teach the people because they're already all there in one space. And then again on Shabbat, on Saturday morning. So what we do in pre-COVID times, because we're not totally doing this right now, is we take the Torah out of the Ark. There are things that are said, some of which, again, comes from the book of Psalms, some from other parts of the Tanakh as well, but the Psalms being the main part at this point. And then we take the Torah scroll into the congregation. We go, down our middle aisle and around the congregation, and people are standing when the Torah is taken out as a sign of respect. And they will take either their talit, their prayer shawl, or their prayer book and touch the Torah scroll and then kiss either their talit or their prayer book. There's a tradition that as the Torah is being taken around a sanctuary, you never turn your back to it. So because it's so important. And then it's brought back up onto the bima, the raised area, the platform, the pulpit, whatever terminology you'd like to use, where people have the honor of undressing the scroll, and people have the honor of reading or chanting from the scroll, and people have the honor of saying blessings before and after the readings. And then similarly, in reverse, people have the honor of dressing the scroll. And actually the tradition is before the scroll is dressed, it is held up high and turned to face the congregation, so the congregation can see the Hebrew words that have just been read or chanted, and then people dress it. And then it's, again, in a traditional setting, it's taken back down through the congregation and then put back into the ark.
And explain what you're dressing it and undressing it in.
So there's a whole bunch of different parts, and this is where you'll have to all come and visit us at the synagogue. We love to have church visiting groups on Friday nights. And as we come out of the pandemic, we're hoping to be able to resume that. So it's a little easier to show, but the scroll itself is written on a special kind of parchment from a kosher animal. And so it's rolled tight, and there is a sash that is put around it. And some of these sashes were some kind of cloth that was then tied, in it like a bow. Ours happens to have Velcro on it, keeps it a little bit more secure. It takes away from some of it, I think, when you hear the noise and take the 2 parts of the Velcro apart. But there's a sash, and that is to keep the scroll nice and tight, because if it's on 2 rollers and if it gets loose, it can damage the parchment. And then there's some kind of a cover that goes over the top 2 parts of the poles. and every synagogue, ours happen to have, we have 5 Torah scrolls in our ark. They're all exactly the same, Genesis through Deuteronomy, except some are taller, bigger than others. Some are smaller. And ours happen to all be dressed in the same kind of a cover. Some synagogues you go to have different ones. Sometimes they're made, the covers are made by members of the congregation, all sorts of things. And then there's a breastplate that is put over it, a yad, which is a pointer, and then some kind of a crown is put on the top fold. Now, everything that I just described, except for the pointer, is what the ancient priests used to wear when they were officiating at the temple in Jerusalem. So when the people would bring their offerings or sacrifices as they are mentioned, as they're commanded in the Torah for different holidays and different life cycle times, they would bring those offerings or sacrifices to the temple, and then the priests would actually make the offerings, and they would get dressed up, and they would have a sash, and they would have a beautiful garment over them, and some kind of a breastplate and something on their heads. And so when the temple was destroyed for the second time in the year 70, our ancestors had a choice. Either Judaism could have died right then and there, because no longer were we able to actually, worship in the way that we had been taught, or adjustments could be made. And in this case, there was nowhere for the priests to make these offerings anymore. And what starts to develop over the course of time is the prayer service that we have today. And so they decided to take what the priests wore and put it on our holiest ritual object, which would be the Torah scroll. And so that's how we get each of those parts. So not only are we remembering that Moses brought the Torah down from the mountain into the people, but also we're remembering our ancestry, that in ancient times, and this is how people worship, they had a priest who made these offerings on their behalf, said certain prayers on their behalf, and so on. And then, of course, that changes with the destruction of the Second Temple, and people start to, it actually starts a little bit before then, where people start to say prayers on their own, in their own homes or their own communities, because not everyone could go to Jerusalem to make the offerings themselves. And then after the destruction of the temple, it develops further, and until eventually we have what we have today.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you take the Torah scroll out and you roll it out on the table. Does the table have a name?
We, in English, we just call it a Torah table.
Okay, Torah table. So you
Yeah.
roll it out on the Torah table, and then what happens in worship then, and how do you hear and process and receive that word from God?
So we read Torah on Shabbat mornings and on holidays. We don't read it on Mondays and Thursdays. So when we've done that, when we've brought it out of the ark and brought it down to the people, which, by the way, is not only a reminder of what happened on Mount Sinai, but also is the idea that the Torah is for everyone, right? So there are some religions where the learned people only, right, are in charge of knowing the scriptures and teaching it to people. And while we have that, and we certainly have clergy, and my role is in many ways similar to your role, really my primary job is to teach, okay? And but also other people can. So once the Torah is read or chanted, then very often there's some kind of a sermon, some kind of a teaching. Sometimes I teach as I go. I'm reading something, I might translate a little bit about it, and I'll say, oh, this is about such and such and such, or here's how we can relate to it today, or what have you. Sometimes it's a straight sermon, that I would offer, written paper, introduction, tell people what the text is about, what we can learn from it today, conclusion kind of stuff. So it comes in a lot of different forms as to how we do that. And then And then, of course, the all of the honors that I was mentioning before. Anyone who's Jewish can be called to the Torah for any of these honors. Doesn't matter if you know anything about Judaism, you can come up and help undress the scroll. You do need to know some Hebrew to be able to have the honor of saying the prayers that go before and after the scroll. But in theory, anybody can, because this book, if you will, is everyone's book. It's not just the learned people. Excuse me, it's not just the clergy. It's for everyone. So, for instance, a couple of weeks ago, I was on vacation, and so one of my members led the worship service and gave a sermon. She happened to not talk about that week's Torah portion quite so much, and she talked about something else that was Jewishly related. But she educated herself about her topic and then shared it with people. So it's for all of us. And we try to show that in many different forms.
Mm-hmm. And so your worship service includes reading from the Torah, the Haftorah. Mm-hmm. Is the Haftorah before or after the Torah reading?
After. The Haftorah from one of those other books in the Bible, in the Tanakh, comes afterwards. And often there'll be some kind of an explanation as to what the connection is. Or in the books that we have in our pews, they often give, not often, they do give an explanation of what's going on in the book, let's say, of Isaiah itself at that point, and then also what's the connection to the calendar, to that week's Torah portion. Why was this chosen? So that's read afterwards, and it's our custom. We dress the Torah scroll after it's read or chanted, and we keep it out of the ark while the Haftarah is being read, and then we put the Torah back. But different congregations do things in different ways. There's not a steadfast rule, like everyone has to do it this way. They'll probably most do it the way that we do, but you don't have to. Yeah.
So is that like the highlight of a worship service?
So yeah,
the highlight of ours would be communion, but
yeah,
the highlight of a Presbyterian one might be just the sermon.
Yeah. I think that yes, I mean, visually what's happening, there's stuff happening up on the pulpit. People are moving around, people are called up for different honors. So yes, for a Shabbat morning when we read Torah, yes. On a Friday night when we have worship, sometimes I read Torah, sometimes I don't. More often there is a sermon. I'd like to think that the sermon is the highlight of the service, but other people would say, no, they really love the music that we're singing during the service or whatever it might be. So in one way or another, I guess the sermon or the reading of Torah or a combination should be the highlight, because that's where we're learning. That's where we're figuring out, how does this ancient text relevant to us today? So for instance, when I have a bar or bat mitzvah student who at age 13 become responsible for the commandments, and they have learned enough Hebrew to read from the Torah and so on, they give like a miniature sermon. And I give them an outline of what I want. The first part is I want them to give a summary of what their Torah portion's about. And the second part is, what does it mean for you today? What can you, as a 13-year-old child living in the East Lansing area, where there's not a lot of Jewish people and so on and so forth, what do you learn from it that we can then learn from you? So for some of the things, there's some very obvious lessons, and for others it's a struggle. When we get to the book of Leviticus, and there's all sorts of sacrifices that we no longer do. Some of the kids struggle with that, but some adults do too. It's not always easy preaching those weeks as an adult.
I was going to ask about Leviticus. When you're reading through Leviticus, it's pretty detailed and not a lot of story or narrative going on, and a lot of laws related to things that are temple. What do you do with Leviticus?
So we have this narrative from Genesis through Exodus, and then we have this insertion of Leviticus, and scholars think that it was written by other people from the priesthood, and then Numbers picks up where Exodus left off, right? So there's this insertion, and so there are certainly sermons about what do we sacrifice. Either a bar bat mitzvah kid might talk about how they sacrifice time with their friends or on sports teams while they're learning what they need to learn to become bar bat mitzvah. So sacrifice itself, like how do we see it today? But also just trying to understand. So I'll just give you here's a short little sermon. Okay, so in Hebrew, the word sacrifice is korban. And the Hebrew root for that word means to draw near. So this was our ancestors' ways of trying to draw near to God. They may not have been as sophisticated in some ways as we are, or they didn't, the concept of worship was not there. And this is how they knew to worship God, was to give of something that they had to God. Now, remember, when those animals are sacrificed, then the priests, that was how they fed themselves and their families, right? So you and I get a paycheck from our congregations, but it's the same idea, right? We are being fed from the gifts that our members bring. But what they were doing theologically, so there's that practical side, but theologically was they were finding ways to draw near to God. So I've often given sermons about, we don't worship in this way anymore, but how do we draw near to God? And a given year, a given week, I might have, some specific ideas to give people. I might say to them, this is our challenge. Let's find ways to draw near to God. What does that mean? So for some people, that means spending more time out in nature where they feel God more. For some people, that means learning more about tradition, about Judaism, where they feel a connection to God in that way. I mean, it can mean a lot of different things. So those portions are not necessarily the easiest ones in the world to learn from, but that's part of it. You're supposed to struggle with these teachings, right? So Jews traditionally are called Yisrael, the ones who struggle with God, right? And we're supposed to take our texts and our traditions, and struggle is not always the greatest word because it might have some negative connotations, but we're supposed to grapple. That's probably better. We're supposed to grapple with these texts and these traditions and figure out what is meaningful to us today. What my ancestors did may not be so meaningful to me. What my even closer relatives, my grandparents, okay, three of my four grandparents came from the old country. How they learned Judaism is different than how I learned Judaism. And I live in a country that's very different about how I can practice my Judaism as compared to what they had. So we're supposed to grapple with these things and find what's meaningful to us and do that. So those are the kinds of sermons that I probably give most often when we get to the book of Leviticus.
How do you grapple with the priest will come and remove the mildew from the walls of your home?
Right. When my bar mitzvah kids get that Torah portion, they often will look at me and they'll be like, Rabbi, what do I do with this? Okay, well, let's talk about that. And there are things you can learn about that, right? And about what it means to have our bodies be pure, and even that our homes can be. So even if we don't actually have things in our walls today, how we act in our homes, how we set up our homes, how we're welcoming to strangers in our homes, all of these different kinds of things can be pulled from these texts.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about the law? Because as you know, in Christianity, Paul especially sets up this dichotomy between law and grace that the Protestants like Martin Luther really took to extremes.
Right.
And yet in Judaism, the law is a blessing and the law is good and the law is to be loved. So, can you talk a little bit about that and why the law is a wonderful thing?
Sure. So, I made a point at the beginning of this when I used the word Torah to talk about how it's a teaching as opposed to translating as law. And this is
Mhm.
part of the reason why. Um, so we have in the Torah, we have 613 commandments. Now, a good 200 of them apply only when the temple is in Jerusalem. So they don't apply now. But we're still supposed to study all of them and learn from them. Whether you believe that God actually commanded you to do or not do these certain things, to me, as a Reformed Jew on the liberal end of the spectrum, is irrelevant. The fact is that they're there. Our ancestors learned from them, and we can learn from them. So, Reformed Judaism, before it was called Reformed Judaism, was often referred to as prophetic Judaism, where those Jews who followed that were much less concerned about the ritual commandments and much more about what the prophets taught about being good people and how to make our world a better place. Tikkun olam, the repair or the perfection of the world, is a huge concept within Judaism. And really, really, in the more liberal movements, it's really hammered home. If I did a search of all the sermons where I used the phrase Tikkun olam, I'm sure I would have like the majority of mine would probably have something about that in there. So we would take those texts about how we're supposed to treat the stranger, how we're supposed to treat each other in various forms, and use those as, I guess you could say, the building blocks for what we do, right? So, and these teachings play a huge role in why I'm doing what I'm doing with you today, why I do interfaith work, why I come and usually speak actually in other houses of worship or welcome people to ours, because throughout these texts we have teachings about welcoming people who are not part of our group, the stranger is how it's usually translated. Being part of a greater community. How do we make our communities better? Not just the Jewish community, but the greater community. There's all sorts of teachings based on the Tanakh, but then in other genres of literature that come afterwards that talk about, making sure that the dead of other communities are buried appropriately. If, and there's a text, if you find someone dead on the road and there's clearly no community around that can take care of them, as a Jew, you're obligated to do that. You're obligated to help. We see that play out in current times when there are sometimes when there are catastrophes or when there are people who are indigent or what have you. And I often read articles about how Jewish funeral homes in our communities make sure that person gets a proper burial, even though they're not part of our community and so on. So all of these texts that start with the Tanakh, with the Jewish Bible, and then go on to a variety of other kinds of texts that are even still being written today, they all teach us about what our role is in this world and how we're supposed to make it a better place. And so that's really my job, as I see it, is to teach people about that and to figure out what our role is. And it's all comes from the Tanakh, even though there are parts that are difficult to get through. And even though there are parts that we really struggle with, we don't just throw them out, right? We don't just throw out the book of Leviticus because it's hard. We find ways to find meaning.
So, we wanted to talk a little bit about the God of the Old Testament, and I'm putting quotes around the God of the Old Testament because a lot of times Christians have an understanding of these scriptures that come from whether their tradition was Catholicism or evangelicalism or Episcopal Church, where somehow we've been taught that Jesus is good and Jesus's Father is good, but that somehow Jesus came and I don't know. This was the original heresy in Christianity. This guy Marcion
Mm-hmm.
said that the God of Hebrew Scriptures was not Jesus's real father, and that there was a better God that sent Jesus in an end run around the God did this. And this is the
That's
first
interesting.
this is
I
the
never,
first heresy and the first time Christians said, no, wait, that's not what we teach. We do not teach the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is the God and Father of our
yeah,
Lord Jesus Christ. There is not some other nicer God in the background.
right.
But Christians continue to struggle with these texts are far more ancient
Mm-hmm.
than the ones we have in the New Testament. And God sometimes, like, oh, look, my servant Job, he's so awesome. I'm going to ruin his life.
Right. I mean, that's a huge one. It's a very big struggle. I mean, I think so. When you asked me to speak at your church a number of years ago about this topic, I really struggled with it because I was like, I don't know. I don't see God as being a bad God. That's not what we teach at all. And since then, as I shared with you yesterday, since then, I sometimes I'm reading a portion, I'm like, that must be what they're talking about. I can see how that this text might be problematic. So one of the images that I came up with was thinking about God as a parent, and that's certainly one of the images that we share. Especially at the High Holy Days, we refer to God. There's a whole prayer called Avinu Malkeinu, our Father, our King, and it talks about we're pleading to God to take care of us in this new year and so on. But the reference to our Father, our King, is that God is the eternal parent, and also at the same time, God is the ruler who judges what we do. And so this idea of God as parent, when I spoke in your church, I really liked the idea that parents, even today, when parents have their first kid, their eldest kid is like the experimental kid, right? Like they may have read a lot of stuff about how to be parents, but until they're actually 24/7 in that role, they don't exactly know what they're doing. Not one parent that I've ever talked to felt comfortable right away as a parent. And so I sort of liken that to this, that God as the parent of this group of people who, followed him at the beginning and then got, cranky. Like if you look at the book of Exodus, the people are always complaining to Moses, yes, you took us out of slavery. Thank goodness we aren't slaves as we were for the last several hundred years, but we don't have enough food. We don't have this, and we're tired. We don't want to keep blah, 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 blah. Right. And we want to go back to that bad thing that you took us from, and Moses is at wit's ends, and Moses says to God, like, what do I do? Right. I really think of that as God gets angry with the people. So why is that? Well, they're not following what God said. God laid down the laws, the rules, just like a parent lays down the rules of their home, and kids don't always follow them, and then they get punished. That's how they learn certain things and whatever. And I think that there is something to that. I don't know that it's an image that works 100% of the time, but I think there's something to that. And I think that you can say like God had like a learning curve kind of thing. Also, I think because I see this as a human document, I don't see this as having really come from God. That also means that people wrote this document. So there are things in there that seem to contradict each other and so on. But it's also the people's interpretation of God, right? So there is a prayer that we've adapted in the Reform movement because theologically we don't agree with it. But there is a traditional prayer that basically says, God will give you, and it comes from the Torah, God will give you rain in the right season for your crops if you behave yourself, if you do the right thing. I don't really believe that God controls our daily lives in that way. but I can see where that comes from. A parent is going to say, if you do the things I tell you to, I'm going to give you your allowance.
We're going to Disney World.
Right. I was saying we're going to go to the zoo or whatever. Right. Exactly. Right. So I definitely see some parallels in there. Like I said, I'm not sure it works 100% of the time. So I can see why at least some Christians might look at what the readings are in the New Testament. And I'm by no means an expert in the New Testament, though I did study it a long, long time ago. Jesus comes, and most of what Jesus teaches is still what I'm teaching today, right? Because Jesus was teaching from the scripture that he had, which is the scripture that I still have today, and that you share with us. And Jesus was teaching these things, but Jesus did go in places where our text definitely didn't, in allowing certain people to be part of the community and so on. And so I can see how people today would look back and say, see, look, Jesus is being nicer than this Old Testament God, right? I can see that. I don't agree with it because, like you were mentioning, that this God is God, right? Like we have different ways of thinking of God, right? You have the Trinity, we don't have the Trinity. But, like when I spoke in a Catholic church a million years ago, somebody was really, really struggling with what I was teaching. And finally, and he couldn't understand how we didn't believe in the Trinity, which is another session for another time. But the priest finally had to get up and say, when the rabbi is speaking about God, she is speaking about God the Father. It is the same God that we have. And I don't know that satisfied that person, but at least made him quiet. That we have different ways of understanding God. We have different ways of worshiping God. But there's just this one God, period. And we found different ways of interpreting. So I don't know if Moses ever existed. I don't know if Jesus ever existed. To me, that's not the important thing. To me, the important thing is what we learn from what we have, the remnants that we have of them, and what we have of them is scripture. So yes, so I don't teach about Jesus other than when I'm doing comparative religions, but Jesus was Jewish, and what he taught, 97% of what he taught is Jewish. And so, but there were places where he was perhaps nicer than the Jewish authorities living in his time. And I can see how that would make people look at that and say, like, okay, we've got a nice God, and that Old Testament God is the mean God. I get it. I don't agree with it, but I get it.
Yeah, and what I think people in modern times don't realize is at the time the Christian church was starting, there was a great grief that most Jews did not accept Jesus as the Jewish Messiah, and it was the Gentiles
Yes.
who bought
Right.
in. And
Mhm.
so then what do you do about the people who are supposed to be saying, well, yeah, here's our Messiah, he came, and
Mhm.
they don't do that. And that first original split there has carried through our shared history for all
Right.
these millennia.
Absolutely. And we can at some point do a session on why Jews don't believe Jesus is the Messiah. But yeah, a
I
lot of people.
guarantee you everybody watching this right now is like, yes.
So I'm happy to do that, and hopefully we can do that at some time when I can actually be with you. So
Yeah.
let's try to do that. But the short version is that Jesus did not fulfill the requirements of the Messiah as understood by the Jews. And in his time, there were Jewish people who followed him. But when he died, they went back to the synagogue for the most part, right? Then we get Saul, who becomes Paul, and so on. But yeah, I mean, that was a huge split, absolutely. And my high school students and I talk about it. I have a student who knows somebody who calls themselves a Jew for Jesus, and he tries to understand how you can do that. And I'm like, you can't. Jews don't believe in Jesus as the Messiah, and so you can't also believe that Jesus is the Messiah. Like, you can't be both. You either have to be Jewish or you have to be Christian or another religion, obviously, but that they don't work together, right? And so there is a point. I can come and worship with you, and I've certainly worshiped in many churches, spoken from pulpits, and I can participate in a lot of things, but there are certain things that you say that you pray that I can't participate in, which is fine. I totally get that and respect that and understand that. So so there is that difference, but a lot of what you do and a lot of what I do is the same.
Yeah. Or even going to the Islamic Center, I can say God is great. I can't say Muhammad is his prophet,
Right,
but
right,
I can say God is great.
right, right. And just as you have, right, you have a stopping point where prophecy ended, right? So for
Hmm.
us, prophecy ended with Ezra and Nehemiah. Okay. And remember that those are the last couple of books. There's First and Second Chronicles after that, but there's right at the end of the Tanakh. So, I have had Jewish people say, well, we might not believe in Jesus as God or as the Messiah or whatever terminology, but he was a great prophet. No, not in Jewish tradition. Jewish tradition says prophecy ended at this time. Christianity would say the same thing. Obviously, Islam, recognizes all sorts of prophets from both of our traditions
Right.
and through Muhammad, right? So,
Muhammad.
so, so there's
It is
everyone has their
interesting
own
to me,
thing.
and we should stop, but this is a comparative religion thing that at some point, to be in a faith, there is like a little hedge
Mm-hmm.
around your faith. And if you step
Absolutely,
outside the
that's right.
hedge, you can do that, but you're not in the faith anymore.
Yes, exactly.
The hedges don't all flow into each other. I mean, we can shake hands across the hedge,
Right.
um,
I
but
love it. It's a great
we
image.
actually believe different things. And same thing with Imam Sohail,
Mm-hmm.
and I think he's great, and we're the Abrahamic faiths, right?
Right.
But we each approach the one God with a different
Yeah.
understanding, and we're not just one mushy thing.
Right. Right. That's what makes us different, right? Otherwise, we would
Yeah,
just be all one religion, right?
yeah,
So it also is what makes life interesting in many ways,
yes,
both the
it
good and the
plays
bad.
a part. Yeah. Well, thank you for doing
My
this.
pleasure. My pleasure.
And maybe what I'll do is if people have questions, I can email them to
I
you
was
and then
actually
maybe
just going to
read your
offer that.
answers
Absolutely.
later. Okay.
Absolutely. And hopefully sometime in the future where it's a little safer and where my schedule on Sunday mornings matches better with your schedule when I don't have religious school, we'll come in and I can answer questions in person or
That
do
would
it
be
on
great. We
the
love
whatever.
when you do that.
It's been a long time since I'm grateful that you host us for our monthly clergy meetings, but it's been a long time since I've actually been in your space in other ways. So
Yeah,
I look forward to being with you.
me too. Thank
Thanks
you.
very much.